Hi, Monique.
Hi, Chad.
Hi. Oh, thank you so much for joining us for this.
It is really nice to see you. I miss seeing you in person. I owe you a trip out to beautiful Glen Ellen at some point in time soon, but
I miss you too. I'd love to, can't wait to have you out to Common Goodwin. But I am so glad that you're able to just join us virtually here. It is an honor and a pleasure to know you, and honestly to get to experience the things that you have shared with the world from your expertise. So for everyone who's watching via Instagram or Facebook or however it is you found this video, Monique is one of, if not the most knowledgeable people I've ever met regarding whiskey and spirits, period. Monique, would you like to sort of introduce yourself, your position, what it is you do in this world?
my position is hunkered down in the basement with all the whiskey. No, thank you. That is really, really kind of you. I'm still learning, and that's why I've been in whiskey for, over 20 years. And my great love is scotch. It has been for a long time. This is all single malt scotch behind me. But my current job position, my paying position during all of this, I'm the vice president of spirits portfolio for an import and distribution company. So we're the people that help get the products into the United States and then get them from the, out to the different states and then help get them into stores and into amazing whiskey collections like that at Common Good. So we figure out how to legally get those things through all the loopholes so that you can drink them across the bar or buy them off of a store shelf. So awesome. Various different roles in the industry. Used to run the largest whiskey bar in the United States. And so really at base, I think of my role as being an educator.
For someone like me, I love whiskey, used to be able to be the beverage director for a big whiskey bar as well. But for someone like me, when I'm in that role, there are so many whiskeys out there. I have to rely on the expertise of people like you. And I have to come to you and be like, all right, help me understand what I'm looking for, what I'm trying to taste. And so honestly, today, that's what I'm trying to do with you for guests who might be listening, who have a love for scotch or who are trying to develop a love for scotch, who might get overwhelmed in the aisles of a liquor store, whose eyes blur when they see so many different brands and regions that are supposedly supposed to dictate the flavor profiles. And I think there's a lot of information out there and a lot of misinformation out there. But at Common Good, we have a number of your products, not only from the portfolio of the distribution import export company that you're the vice president of the spirits division for, but also bottles from barrels that you hand selected. Can you just share with us, like, how does one get to do something like that? That's what that to me sounds like a dream job, like a beautiful journey. Like, how did you get to this point?
I've been in whiskey for 22 years. So when I started, I'm from Nebraska, and when I started waitressing at this pub, they had a really sophisticated single malt scotch collection. I didn't know what scotch was. I was not a drinker. I really just kind of started exploring wine, and I was kind of nervous, like an anxious drinker, really a bit of a control freak, which just in general. And, so the first time we had a Christmas party at the bar, and our owner was like, "You've never had scotch before. Well, let's remedy that right now." And actually, it's one of the reasons I think you've got a Strathyla in front of you. And it's one of the reasons why when I see casks from Strathyla aging, I'm just like, oh, that was the distillery that I first tasted single malt scotch from. Granted, wow. It was a 40-year-old, and now that bottle's worth thousands of dollars. But it's like, if the man didn't want me to fall in love with scotch, like, that was not the right thing to put in.
Right.
And just started down this path of reading everything I could get my hands on. I was in Scotland within a year, touchdown, and it's like the smell, the earth, like everything. I was like, I've been here before, like there's something like in me, and have made up until this year 2 trips to Scotland a year for going on 15 or so years.
Wow.
And in early 2000s, I got a call at the bar from the gentleman. So the 4 Signatory bottles that are near you, not the Glenallachie. The gentleman that owns the Edgewood Distillery, the Signatory independent bottling company, literally called the landline phone at the bar. And he said, "You guys are, the bar is one of our biggest customers. You're in Nebraska, talk to me about Nebraska. Like, who is drinking this?" And it's like, anybody I could get to listen to me. You know, it's people would come in and they would ask for kind of a pedestrian, but very high quality. They would come in and ask for Johnny Walker, you know, a blended Scotch, or Dewar's, or if they knew single malt, it was Glenlivet, Glenfiddich, fabulous whiskeys, very consistent, you know, considered the best in the world because they are. I mean, they're way up there. But I wanted to take everybody to the next level. Like, I've got you. I've got one hook in you. How do we figure out the next thing? And so we started selling a lot of independently bottled whiskey, and it was recognized on the other side of the pond. And he literally called and said, if we bring you over with the buyer from Binny's, who's based here in Chicago, and he was already my friend because we're nerds in the industry, he said, if we bring you over, we think you would have the best interaction, the best knowledge of what the American palate is drinking right now. Like, would you pick the barrels that we're going to bottle in 2005? We're like, yeah. So that was amazing. I mean, it was unbelievable. I'd been, but you know, you're touring through warehouses that have thousands of barrels from every distillery, you know, the ones that we know, Macallan, Glenlivet, they're aging stuff that was distilled at Macallan, distilled at Glenlivet, but these are one-off barrels that got sold to them as opposed to getting sold into a blended Scotch. Yeah. And we just get to go around and taste them. And then, you know, you're kind of like, I think this is pretty good. Okay, so if we think it's pretty good, and you're kind of sipping on stuff all day, you're spitting, we're professional. Sure. But you end up with something like, we bring back these little samples and we taste them dead sober with a panel of people from Binny's, a panel of people from my company, and then it's kind of like get the confirmation of the group that this is something that we think would do well in the market, that the American palate would really like. And so then, you know, we negotiate price and we pick what we want them, you know, the label to say, and there we go. So yeah, all of those in front of you are single barrels. So those are, when they're gone, they're gone. They're all bottled at barrel proof, at cask strength, because that's the way that we tasted them. It's a little strong for some people. Right. Add water, drink it on the rocks, do whatever you want to do with it. But that is exactly the form that we tasted them in the barrel, that we were like taken by. You know, so sure. Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, it took a long time to get. Yeah. You know, yeah.
I mean, of course it would. I think it's journey worth it for us at least. So tell me, you say single bottle or single barrel scotches. Has that always been a thing? Like, when did it start becoming a thing to your knowledge? Because I know, at least coming from like the bourbon world, like single barrel bourbons were something that was kind of done in response to single malt scotches that try to get like a top shelf, like American whiskey product. Single barrels, is that a relatively new thing in Scotch, or what's your thoughts?
It's not as new as the movement to premiumize in bourbon. You're absolutely spot on. Single malt just meaning single distillery, all malted barley, so very different flavor profile from bourbon, which is going to be corn, and you know, rye, that's going to be rye based. The bulk of the market for Scotch, if we're just talking about the category, 90% of Scotch drinkers still drink blended Scotch. They drink Johnny Walker, they drink Dewar's. The 10% are single malt Scotch drinkers, but they're probably, most of them are drinking the top 10 malts, that, you know, the Glenfiddich, Glenlivet, Glenmorangie, you know, getting into some Islay, Ardbeg, Lafroy, things like that now. So this is an even more smaller, you know, subset of that. I bet it's a 0.1%, you know, of people that are drinking single malt Scotch. So this is fairly new, because you wouldn't have had, these are strong flavors because they're cask strength and they haven't been heavily filtered. You got to graduate through it. You know, for a lot of these, if any one of those cask strength whiskeys in front of you was the first whiskey that you handed someone, or the first Scotch that you handed someone, they're an exploration. They are to expanding your palate. They can be very challenging, but like when you fall in love, you fall so far in love with these things. You go down that path. Yeah, it's pretty new. I would say there's classic old school houses that have bottled independently. Gordon MacPhail and Cadenhead's being the oldest two. So there's bottles from both of those guys behind me, and they're still operating, and they're absolutely amazing. And they're different to and competitive with the Signatory range that's sitting in front of you. Sure. But okay. Yeah. And so they've been doing a little bit of that since the 1890s, 1930s, but really this is a phenomenon that has occurred and grown in the past 20 years.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for that information. One thing that like I'm just curious about while I'm looking at these. So I have a 6 year, I have a 10 year. This one is 20 years, 25 and 29 years. They all look really light in color. Can
Mhm.
you tell me about your choices that have led to the colors looking the way they do?
We don't add artificial color to anything that I bottle. So none of the things that we import or handle in most markets, we don't. The only thing that you can add to a single malt scotch is a chemical colorant called E150A. We do have a perception that darker is older is probably more expensive.
Uh-huh.
And same in bourbon, you can't even add E150A. But with scotch, you're typically using a barrel for the second time. They're very often buying something, a used bourbon barrel, because Scots are notoriously cheap. So they're getting the second use of that bourbon barrel, or third or fourth, or cognac barrel, whatever it is. So you're not getting quite as much color. You're allowing the bourbon or the original distillate to take a lot of that color. You're still getting the effects of what was in the barrel. You're still getting some like vanilla and some coconut and whatever the bourbon tasted like. But we don't get too attached to the color as it really looks in terms of age. So it's like interesting, just as I'm glancing at those, they do get a little bit darker, but in particular, that very first one, that Ardlair, is only 6 years old and it looks darker than the Strathyla next to it. But its alcohol content is off the charts. It's over
Right.
60%. It's crazy. So it's more concentrated. And, it's just one of those things, like, you just can't get attached to the color of it. The point is that we don't add anything unnatural. These are the color at which, we taste them in kind of a dark warehouse. Does it taste good? Does it have a nice mouthfeel? Does it have a nice finish? Like, we don't get attached to that at all.
I mean, just so one of the ways, and how would I phrase this? I think like during the pandemic, people have been maybe moving around to safer areas. I think one particular like town that's been growing in population is Nerd Town. And I think that's that was terrible.
Yes.
But I think like we all have this like itch that we want to scratch, that we can learn more about like the details of it. And like I think one of the nerdy but I think really important things about scotches for me, as I've like learned from you, is about like I feel like I can taste caramel color. Maybe it's a psychological thing, but do you feel like when there is caramel color added, it does actually add some sort of flavor to the scotch as well?
I don't know where it is right this second, but I have a bottle of E150A that some brave person at an undisclosed company gave to me, because people that use it say, oh no, it's just a little bit for color. It doesn't have any flavor to it. But it's like when you handle it, it's like burnt sugar. It's like if you burn and break caramel baking in your kitchen or something like that. It's got a burnt note to it. It does have a sugary sweetness to it in concentration, and a drop could probably color a case of scotch. I mean, it takes a teeny tiny little bit to make it look 10 years older, or, whatever it is. But it also, there's a stickiness to it. There's a textural thing that I get when I have a scotch that has had color added. I can feel it on my lips. I can feel it in the finish. There's almost like aspartame. There's a little bit of an artificial note to it.
Let's take a trip from Nerd Town to Flavor Town. So these are all scotches that we carry at Common Good. We use one of them in a cocktail, in actually several different cocktails, and we use the rest of them just in flights and everything. And I want to encourage any of you at home, if you want to buy flights of them, they will be available even to go, to bring them home and taste them. Let's go through these one by one. So starting with this one, Ardlair. Am I saying that right? Ardlair?
Yeah, Ardlair is a really interesting one. So when I saw this on the butt end, the side of a barrel, Ardlair, what's that? It's not the name of a distillery. If you Google it, Ardlair is not a thing. It is from the Ardmore distillery, but Ardmore is one of the core single malt scotches in the Teacher's Blend, which is extremely popular in the UK. And it's peated. So it's got this light smokiness to it that really defines the flavor of Teachers, and this kind of density, intensity in the blended whiskey. But they also make a non-peated version that they call Ardlair. And I always had heard that, like it was a legend, like, oh, we make this, and it probably goes into Teachers as well, and maybe goes into some other blended scotches, but I've never seen a barrel of it for sale. So it was like, we're in this big warehouse, you see all the familiar names, and then Ardlair, wait a second. Okay, I got to go back and figure out, like, why do I know that? Why does it sound familiar? So of course we're like, we have to taste it. It's 6 years old. It's beautiful. It's bright. I mean, it tells you right on the bottle, this is in a refill butt, which means it's in an ex sherry barrel, an ex rebuilt sherry barrel. It's also why this one's a little bit darker, because this used to hold sherry wine, which is fairly dark, Oloroso sherry. It's bottled at 63.3% alcohol. So whiskeys like this go into the cask at 63.5. This lost 0.2% alcohol in 6 years in the barrel. So we don't know that when we're tasting it. You know, we tasted it and we were like, whoa, like this is a little strong. And it is a little strong. This is one that I just added a little bit of water to it. But would I cut it with water by half, you know, or by a third? I don't think so. I think it kind of like would destroy it, like the oomph and the bravado. Yeah. I mean, it's just such a unique whiskey.
Yeah. I mean, and one of the things that we loved about it that made us want to use it in cocktails was the bravado of it. We felt like we could add other things to it without losing its character. I think with some scotches that are more like gentle, like an unpeated, you lose a lot of the characteristics, especially in shaken cocktails where citrus is added and other flavors can come in. So this has been kind of a go-to for us in some shaken cocktails. Man, I love this so much because I get this like, this could sound really weird, but I get this like, I think this last year I had this local spring honey that just tasted, I mean, honey, but floral and bright and light on its face. That I love this aspect of it.
It's
for me,
super herbaceous. And yeah. Chad, you're exactly spot on. When we tasted it, we were like, it's really young, but it is very characterful. It's got beautiful intensity. A little splash of water actually kind of opens up some of those floral nuances, some of those even vegetal nuances. Yeah. Very rare to find in a young whiskey, but not surprising. It comes from a distillery that you know, has been a heritage brand, you know, for 100+ years.
All right, let's move on to this next one. Oh, that's the Strahila.
Yeah, this guy's beautiful. So this one matured in a hogshead. So hogshead, like, oh, what's that? We just drank something matured in a butt. We've got some pretty funny terms in Scotch, period. So that last one was a refill sherry butt. Butt is just like the name of the massive barrel. And speaking of Nerd Town, then you can sing I Like Big Butts, and it has completely different meaning. This one's in a hogshead. So this is a rebuilt bourbon barrel. So basically it means that whatever bourbon barrel they used, they were shipped over in staves, because that makes, you know, in some cases it makes a lot of financial sense to ship staves rather than whole barrels. And then when they get them over there, they can't just rebuild the exact same barrel. So you end up with something that's a little bit bigger, and it's called a hogshead. This one's 9 years old. This is the actual sample from this one that I brought back from Scotland. So it's like, I also do keep all of them, and I have for like 15 years, because sometimes when they arrive, I actually taste the samples against them, you know, and just like, oh, okay, was that exactly what we tasted? And it always is. It's a great company. Right. You know, Strahila is just a really stunning, easy drinking, you know, in this one, because it's a used bourbon barrel, you get more of the bourbon notes than you did in Ardler, because that was a used sherry wine barrel. So this, it's like you get those hints. This would be a great one for someone who's a bourbon drinker who hasn't quite found a single malt scotch that they like. You're going to get some of that vanilla, a little bit of coconut, things that are very familiar, but then it's got, you know, it's malted barley. So it's going to have just very different, diverse flavors.
Yeah, you know, it's funny. So, I mean, right off the bat, it is just a touch less concentrated at 58.5%, but it also is a little bit less expressive on the nose. But what I do get are some of those, like, I mean, before you said that, I was like, man, I get like, it's a candy bar. It's like, I think I get like mounds or something in there. That it is what it is. It's like milk, chocolate, coconut, like the vanilla. Those are some of like the flavors right on the nose that I get. And if you're following along at home, let's say like you're watching this, and then you went out and bought the flights, and now you're at home like drinking some of this, like, and you're wondering what like how do you go about just drinking this like straight before you like dilute it or anything? Monique, do you have any advice to like share with?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a glassware snob, but I would say that I would recommend using, if you don't have like a Glencairn snifter or some other kind of tulip-shaped glass, whiskey glass, I would then use a wine glass before I would drink out of like a straight-sided glass or a shot glass or a solo cup. I would go to a wine glass, something that's tulip-shaped. because it concentrates all the aromas that are coming out. So then, you nose it. And when you're nosing, one of the big things people miss, but is extremely important, is to crack your mouth open while you're nosing, because it creates a whole airflow system. And you've got all kinds of things back in your sinuses that when your mouth is closed, you're not using because you're not able to circulate the air. So you actually just kind of like inhale through your nose and mouth. If you feel like you get kind of a big punch of alcohol like you do with these because they're 58.5%, blow back out your mouth and that kind of retronasal breathing, and you'll get all kinds of like non-alcohol flavors start to kind of light up. And then, you can see on the bottle, it's 58.5% alcohol. This is a lot of alcohol. So you kind of like give it a little sip, maybe go back and give it another little second sip because you're going to have a little bit of anesthetization because the alcohol is high. And then determine if you still feel like it's really strong, your just kind of gut is like, oh, my eyes are watering. This is really strong. I'm not tasting that much in it. Add water to it. And I would just like tap water is perfectly fine. And just like add a splash and go back to it. And that splash will kind of open up the nose. That splash will kind of open up the palate. It will certainly make the whiskey a little bit more approachable. And then very important too, when you take a sip, is that, again, retronasal breathing. It's like take a sip, swallow, and then breathe out through your mouth, because that's going to, again, blow that high alcohol away. And that's when you're left with that mountains. That's when you get the milk chocolate and the coconut on this one. And it's beautiful.
So for those of us who might be curious, are all of these specific Signatory vintage single barrel bottlings, are they all Highlands? Where am I right now? Even though it says Strathisla on the bottle, it says Highland up here. Where is this whiskey from?
They're all from Scotland, which is great. So that's why they're Scotch. But there's, depending on who you ask, there are 5 or 6 regions in Scotland. And it's a really great question because it used to mean a lot more than it does. So like the Ardlair that we had, for example, that's a Highland, but it is kind of a light Speyside, non-peated style. But there are things that very characteristically and consistently come from Campbelltown, which is in the southwest of Scotland on the Campbelltown Peninsula, like Springbank. Those have a thread running through them. They are unmistakably Springbank. Absolutely stunning whiskeys. Whiskeys from the island of Islay off the southwest coast of Scotland, where most of the barley is dried over burning peat. Those are traditionally going to be hallmarked by this smoky, peaty, sometimes barbecue, sometimes like a burning tire, all kinds of different things, which may or may not sound appealing. The Campbelltown and Islay, I think those are pretty consistent. That being said, you can make an unpeated whiskey on Islay. You can choose not to dry your barley over burning peat. And then blind, I wouldn't know that it was from Islay. Right. So I get away a little bit from the regionality of things. I think it's a useful tool to have maybe very early on if you're going to go in and sit across a bar, or you're going to go into a store that is overwhelming and you have had Glenfiddich, you're going to go in and say, I know that I like Glenfiddich, or I know that I like a Speyside style. That's right. Going to tell Chad across the bar or Matt in the store, help them give you some direction. But outside of regionality, I actually think it's more useful if you were looking for something new to say to somebody, my favorite thing that I've had to drink recently. I also really like, and these are the kinds of probing questions I ask people when I'm trying to help them find a whiskey that they really like. Do you like chocolate? Okay, do you like white chocolate? Do you like milk chocolate? Do you like dark chocolate? Do you drink coffee? Okay, do you drink it with tons of cream and sugar? Do you drink it black? Do you like espresso? That tells Chad and I a bitterness level, a strength level, like all of these different things. And then we can make educated recommendations based on that. So absolutely. Long answer to a great question. I'm not super stuck on regions, so Signatory, we bottle things from all over the country of Scotland. These just happen to be the ones that you and I chose to drink tonight. And it looks like they're all Highlands. So right. Let's move on to the next. How do you say this? I have heard Clynelish. I've heard Clynelish. How do you pronounce it? I'm guessing the gents I say Clynelish. I'm guessing the people there would say, I don't care how you say it as long as you're drinking my whiskey. So I wouldn't get too caught up in it. Cool. This is gorgeous. I have a tendency to bottle kind of a lot of Clynelish. It is owned by Diageo. So Diageo, largest drinks company in the world. They own Johnny Walker. They own 29 single malt Scotch distilleries, and the bulk of everything they make goes into Johnny Walker because it sells more bottles than anything in the world. Sure. So to be able to kind of like rescue any one of those barrels from going into a blend and just tasting it on its own merits, I always kind of relish the ability to do that. And Clynelish is one in the stable of 29 that they use, is like, it doesn't take a lot of Clynelish to elevate a Johnnie Walker blend. It's what's called a top dresser. It's a top graded single malt that's absolutely stunning on its own. It is, if any of you are fans of Compass Box and John Glazer's blends, he is a very rabid fan of Clynelish and uses it in almost all of his blends. That tells you something. He's got one of the best palates in the industry. In particular, this one, I mean, again, it's more intense. It's definitely got some more age on it. You get that from the nose. There's like a density even in the nose that is just really, really beautiful. But if you're a Clynelish fan, you've really only ever had the standard 14-year-old on the shelf at your local retailer. And it's 40% alcohol. So it's had water added to it. In a lot of cases at 43% alcohol, it's also had color added to it and has been very heavily filtered. So it's kind of a ghost of what this barrel is. For me, Clynelish is always, it's very, very special to get to kind of pull that element out of the respected, Johnnie Walker blend or whatever it is, and just taste it on its own. And then you understand why people fight to put this in Johnnie Walker, to put this into Compass Box. Like, you get on its own why this is such a fabulous whiskey.
For me, when I'm tasting it, maybe it's a weird note, but I get like prosciutto wrapped date.
Ooh, there's a meatiness to it. Clynelish has kind of a meatiness to the spirit. This is also aged in sherry barrel in a sherry butt. So full, not rebuilt, like a full sherry barrel. The outturn was a lot. That's a lot of bottles for a whiskey this age. So it saw a lot of wood contact, not a lot of oxidation, not a lot of it evaporated. And it does kind of, I'm totally with you. It takes on kind of a meatiness that is, there's a little bit of salinity to it. So it kind of like, again, in that prosciutto way, it kind of like leaves your mouth watering. Like you want to immediately go back in and take the next drink.
Yes, I do.
It's lower in alcohol because it's a little bit older. But also, let's say you just tasted these first three blind. It would be very obvious to you which was the oldest, because the finish hits every part of your palate. It's fabulous. You get a little bit of tannin from the barrel. You get that kind of like salty, you're getting the sweetness up front, both from the sherry and from the quality of the whiskey. But like, as I'm talking, it just keeps rolling in waves. Like the finish is just unbelievable.
I like to describe different whiskey experiences in terms of greeting people. For me, this feels like you're meeting someone who's maybe an older relative of a friend, and you go in for the handshake, and they give you a handshake that's a lot more firm than you'd expect, and they bring you in for a really big hug.
I love that. And you're like, yeah, I did want that hug. Yes.
It is that.
Oh, I love that. Wait, so then what were the first two? Were we like on an elbow and then like a fist bump and then...
I feel like if I had to say, the Ardlair would be like a high five that then turns into like suddenly you make your own handshake out of it. Like a high five that goes down in the bottom, and then probably the Strathila would be just like probably just more of a straight hug between friends that's like ends with like the rubbing on the back, and then like
an as expected, friends, like
yes.
Yeah. I love it. I love that about the Clynelish, because I think you're exactly right. It's like you kind of are like, okay, light, okay, da. And then it's like as you swallow, it's like, no, get over here. You're like,
yes,
huggers.
Yeah. So we're about to try a Mortlach 25 year together. I don't know if I've had a better Scotch in my life, and I blame you for ruining me because of this, but
I still have my original cask sample, so I actually get to, I was just telling you today, like, God bless, I get to try this again today, because I've bottled, I don't even want to venture a guess necessarily at how many barrels of Scotch I've bottled. Let's call it a few hundred, and tasted thousands. Like we probably buy 10% of what we taste, let's say. Sure. Of that, no exaggeration, this 25-year-old Mortlach is in my top 5 of all time. It is hallmark classic why people fall in love with older sherry matured Scotch. And so it's, at one point the single malts were like 10 and 12 years old through the 70s and 80s, what you could find, 10 and 12 years old. And then Macallan really premiumized everything. Macallan was like 18-year-old aged in Oloroso sherry cask. And that became, now everybody's going to kind of raise their game. the whiskeys have changed, the quality of the wine barrels have changed, the blends have changed, things like that. But when I taste this Mortlock 25, I go back to 20 years ago when I was first tasting single malt, when I fell in love with it before it kind of became a thing. Spent its entire life in a sherry butt. It's not a refill. It's a fresh sherry butt, so you're getting like a lot of wine. I get chocolate covered cherry. I get so much stone fruit. It's just, it's a pure joy. And this is also one of those, if somebody said, I don't like scotch, I'm never going to drink scotch. Like I'm a bourbon drinker, I'm a rye drinker, or even like I'm a red wine drinker. I don't like scotch. If you taste this and you don't like it, you're not a scotch drinker. You're absolutely right. I've never put this bottle in front of someone and not had them go, oh, wait a second. I didn't know that scotch could taste like this.
So tell me a little, let's say I'm looking at this. I'm like, I've never seen Mortlock before. I haven't seen those single or bottlings of it. Where have I tasted this before? Like, is it in blends anywhere?
It's a top graded, top dressing malt. Mortlock, Linkwood, Longhorn, Kleinleich, there are things like that. Mortlock is almost always used in Johnny Walker blends, and it's in the really high-end ones. It's in the Johnny Walker Blues. It's in those special releases, and it's used fairly sparingly because, there's so much flavor. When you're creating a blend, those are artists. To take, 1,000 barrels and get something blended together and keep Johnny Walker Black tasting consistent, that takes talent. That takes talent that I don't have. Those people are heroes. For me to taste this barrel, and go, yeah, okay, bottle it up. Great. But if you put this exact barrel into something that is a typical blended whiskey and it's fairly moderate, fairly easy drinking, this would distort that recipe. It's just so far off, it would taste nothing like a Johnny Walker that you had ever had before. So there's a lot of cases when these barrels actually even get sold off to independent bottlers, certainly not because they're bad or flawed or there's anything wrong with them, simply that it doesn't fit the profile of what you're trying to create every day. Okay,
let's move on to the oldest one we have for us today. Glenallachie Speyside Single Malt Scotch Whiskey, 1989 single cask. What is this?
I love this whiskey. Absolutely love this whiskey. So this is my cask sample from when we drank this. So it's like 1989. So this is like what I left the distillery with. So we went to the Glenallachie distillery a couple of years ago. We were the importers of the whiskey range, and we had released a core range starting with their 10-year-old. So we had released this core range of Glenallachies, and we were over there, and the owner, distiller, master blender, Billy Walker. Billy is a legend in the industry. He's worked at a number of distilleries. He's been in the industry over 50 years. Most recently, before buying Glenallachie, he owned Benriach and Glendronach and Glenglassa, which were sold to Brown-Forman. So in his 70s, he gets the payout from selling these distilleries. He didn't want to sell the distilleries. His partners decided to do that. And so, of course, he got a bunch of money, but he's like, now I'm like this 70-year-old guy, but I'm young and I've got this great palate and like, I'm not done. I'm not done here. So he's starting to like call around and try and find a distillery to buy because he's got this money. And he reaches out to Pernod Ricard, and he actually tried to buy Scapa, which is way up in Orkney. It's this really beautiful, briny, gorgeous single malt. And they said, no, but have you ever heard of Glenallachie? And like, no one had ever heard of it because every drop of Glenallachie was going into blends. It had never been bottled as a single malt scotch. It's a 50-plus-year-old distillery that had never been bottled as a single malt. So sight unseen, never having set foot on the property, he bought the distillery. He bought, I want to say it was like 30,000 casks of whiskey that were aging there. Knew that it was going into quality blends, so the whiskey was going to be good. And there were casks there going back over 30 years. And just bought it all, kit and caboodle. And so when we launched the initial range, the fanfare has been crazy. They've won so many awards. It's unbelievable. But then he said, well, let's do a single cask. Like, let's do some special things for the United States. So we actually did 2 29-year-old casks and 2 12-year-old casks, all in different wood finishes. And it's just absolutely beautiful. We tasted through, I actually had the Binny's team with me. I want to say we tasted through probably 30 different samples. We brought about a dozen back with us. And my favorites always stay in Chicago. This was my absolute favorite. It's so fantastic. And so now we're in Speyside. We've gone from Highlands to Speyside. Speyside, traditionally considered a little bit more light, more fruity, more floral, more approachable. Again, this is the 29-year-old Scotch that spent its whole life in a sherry butt. So pretty. There's a syrupy quality to it.
Mm-hmm.
There's this stunning mouthfeel.
It almost feels like maple syrup, but it's not like cloyingly sweet. It's just that it's a textural fullness that's really beautiful.
I think whiskeys like this, because they're so complex, this and the Mortlock, you don't want to handle a whiskey on your palate like you do wine. You're not going to like slurp and kind of breathe across it because the alcohol is too high. It'll just blow you up. It'll just send straight up alcohol up your nose into your eyes. But with whiskeys like this, I actually chew on them. So it's like you put it on your palate and just kind of make sure it gets everywhere, because you've got taste buds, all over the place.
That's one of the things that I actually love to do with high proof whiskeys is do just a little bit, let my saliva sort of dilute it, rinse it around. And I think I even fall into like bad habits of like slurping something in and trying to oxidize something that doesn't want to do that. It wants to be moved across your mouth and let your whole mouth experience it in different ways.
I mean, all of these are so special, and obviously I'm so appreciative that you love them as much as I do. I think it really was kind of a spark early on in our friendship, was like, any cocktail you put in front of me is so imaginative, so like bold flavors, but like subtle in the overall, everything. And so it's like, once I let somebody in who I'm like, oh, this person understands flavors, then I'm like, Chad, you gotta try this Scotch. You gotta try this, and you guys are out, you're in Glen Ellen, you're out at Common Good, and your collection is massive. I mean, you have elevated, the experience that people can have, and I think you rival a lot of whiskey bars in the city, in the country. I mean, because it's so curated. You really care. You've tasted every single thing. It was all brought in bottle by bottle thoughtfully, because you appreciated it for what it was. And so it's like, I think that's a lot of our mutual friendship over the years is like, I hate to say this, like sell you things that I wouldn't sell someone else, because I knew that it would have this respected space on the back bar, and you would take the time and the care to speak to someone across the bar about it. And it wouldn't just languish and collect dust, and that's just always been really an amazing connection that you and I have.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Monique, for joining me on this, for sharing your wisdom, expertise with everyone following along at home. Is there anything else that you'd want to say to anyone who's looking to get into independent bottlings of single malts?
I mean, you got to try one, and then, you'll go a little bit down a rabbit hole, but you know what? Pull up with some good whiskeys, like explore these things. And two, Chad, if people are coming in and they're excited about this and they're buying these, like if you even have one of these, but go through this whole experience with us, virtually, but you've got a great partner in Chad, like you can talk them through things. Just use these as an opportunity to expand your palate. These are things to get really excited about. They're really special. They won't break the bank, especially not when you're buying them by the dram. These are really, really affordable and really fun ways to educate and just kind of stretch during all of this. So
thanks again, Monique. I can't wait to see you soon, hopefully.